True North continues to knock it out of the park. We have doubled in size over the past year. We now reach over 10 million Canadians each and every month across our platforms. Our stories are being picked up by our competitors in the legacy media. We're having a real influence on politics and public policy in this country, and we're helping to shape the political culture in Canada. Today, I'm very excited to share some big news with our audience. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. So today I am delighted to announce that True North has hired one of the brightest journalists in the country, a rising star in conservative political circles. I'm proud to announce that Rupa Subramanya will be joining True North as a columnist and a podcast host, and Rupa joins me on the show today. So Rupa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Candice. I'm truly excited to be part of the True North Center team, and I'm really excited about my show, and I have lots of good things coming up, lots of great topics and ideas and guests, and I'm really looking forward to tackling the important issues of the day that matter to us as Canadians, and hopefully issues that nobody in the mainstream media wants to touch, and or they give short shrift to these ideas. And I hope to take them on head on and have meaningful discussions and with my guests. And I'm really excited about this.
Well, we feel very lucky to have you, and it's been great to connect with you over the past few months. For people who aren't completely familiar with you, Rupa is also a columnist over at the National Post. She's written for the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy Magazine. She's a distinguished fellow with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Rupa, you live in Ottawa, and I think a lot of Canadians came to know you and came to see your journalism firsthand during the trucker convoy, because you were doing something that your colleagues in the media failed to do, which was just go out and talk to the truckers and get to know them and try to understand what was motivating them and what they were there for and what it was all about. And it seemed really like basic journalism, but no one else was willing to do it. Instead, they were all too happy to just sort of parrot Justin Trudeau's dismissals of the truckers and his criticisms of them. Some of the most interesting things that we heard was that, these truckers are a bunch of racist white supremacists. And here you are as an Indian woman, and you said that you felt safe and comfortable and that people were nice and kind and welcoming. You didn't see any of those kind of attitudes that the media were trying to tell us about the truckers. So you really did outstanding work. I'm wondering if you could just sort of tell us about why you approached the trucker convoy so differently than everybody else in the media or so many other people in the media in Ottawa.
Well, several different things. So I approached it as a resident of the city, as someone who's just very curious about what was happening in my neighborhood. And I had heard about the convoy before it even arrived. I'd heard about, I read about some of the key players and what Justin Trudeau said about the unvaccinated and the protesters. So I was aware of all of this, the narrative that was already in place before the protesters even showed up. And I was just really intellectually curious to see what was happening in Ottawa. So I walked around and I spent about 8 or 9 hours that day in the bitter cold. And I saw something extraordinary. I saw people, it was people of different backgrounds. It was like Canada Day in the winter. It felt like a winter carnival. I saw some diversity in the crowds as well. And it was just a very it was a joy. It was joyous. It was almost cathartic for a lot of people to be there. People who, we'd been under a lockdown for 2 years, under restrictions for 2 years, where many of us couldn't even see our loved ones, and suddenly there was this explosion of emotions right here in the nation's capital, and that too in some very cold conditions. And that to me indicated that people were there because they were really committed to the cause. They were really dedicated to it, and they really believed in it, and they were willing to spend hours on end to make their voices heard. By the end of that, I came home and I tweeted saying, I think the elites in this country, the political establishment, the media establishment have really misjudged what is happening here. This is much bigger than anything anyone expected. It was bigger than anything I had expected. So for me, it was an eye-opening experience. And also what was interesting was that that first weekend, I got a lot of messages from some of my journalist friends who work for very well-known publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and they were trying to understand what was happening in Ottawa. They asked me, why is there no actual on-the-ground reportage of what is happening in Ottawa? It seems pretty big, but all we keep hearing is that there are a bunch of white supremacists and they're being caricatured. Where are the stories? Where's the actual on-the-ground reportage? And I was, really struck by that question, because everything that we had that was being reported on, if you can even call it that, was just someone's opinion, or just talking from just directly from the Justin Trudeau's talking points. But yet there were all of these people with very interesting stories. They'd come, they'd driven long hours to get to the city. They were there in the cold. They were, and keep in mind that Ottawa was still under a semi-lockdown at that point. And by the end of the first weekend, the Rideau Center closed. There were no washroom facilities anywhere. People literally were just out there all day. You couldn't eat anywhere. You couldn't grab, the only two things that were open were the McDonald's and the Tim Hortons. So there was really nothing you could do except be there to make your voice heard. And so, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I felt that the best way to tackle, so I started tweeting the best way to tackle this corrosive narrative, and I really thought it was a very corrosive narrative that was being pushed by some important journalists and large sections of the media, and of course the political establishment as well. Is that I thought I would tackle it in a humorous way. That I wanted to be sarcastic about it, because there was no other way of taking it on. I couldn't be serious about it. I just had to be. I had to mock the situation, and that's exactly what I did. So here I am, a person of color. I'm walking around, and I'm walking in the badlands of Ottawa. That's how I described Ottawa to my while tweeting, and that here I was being mobbed by people wanting to give me a hug, and they were handing out food, and I felt very threatened, and I was just being ironic about the whole situation. And at first, I think people were a little confused, because sarcasm doesn't always translate well on social media. But then people started to get an idea where I was coming from. I said, wow, this is, I'm really stunned by this. But, first, people from Montreal are coming to Ottawa to party. And that's exactly what was happening. Ottawa became this destination to party. But at the same time, you were also protesting. You were also exercising your right to civil disobedience, and so all of those things were happening. So my tweets got a lot of traction. I think it resonated with a lot of people, because I was saying something that was different. It felt like I was in an alternate reality from what was being reported on by large sections of the media. What I was experiencing there was completely at odds with what was being reported, and that was the reaction of many of the protesters themselves. They tune into your whatever it was, the CBC, the CTV, and they would find that the reporting of it was at complete odds with what they'd experienced. Especially this was especially a strong feeling among people of color that I had interviewed. They couldn't believe that they were somehow that they were being that they were being told that they were part of some white supremacist movement when they experienced something totally different. So I felt at that point, and I've tracked media propaganda for a very long time in various countries. I knew exactly what was going on here, and I knew that this, what was happening here was rather insidious, and I wanted to put a correction to it, and that's exactly, I think, what I did by tweeting about it, and then I was asked to write about it, and I'm glad I did, because I think that was an important contribution to what was being said out there, and it challenged that narrative. I think in a substantial way, and I was happy to play my role in that.
Well, good for you, and absolutely that piece that you wrote for Barry Weiss and her Substack was absolutely must read, essential reading for anyone who wanted to really understand the trucker convoy. And I've said this on the show before, but the photographs that accompanied your piece were just absolutely stunning and beautiful. And I think that the whole thing was incredibly well done. Well, Rupa, I wonder, because to me, I'm similar. I've been monitoring the Canadian media for a very long time, and I've had criticisms about them for a very long time. Seems to me that every time there's a new news story or a new narrative that comes up, they sort of ratchet it up more and more. And the trucker convoy was like peak Laurentian elite biased media. Like, they had no interest in telling the story. They only had an interest in pushing the narrative that they previously decided on. And to so many people, to your point, that was a turning point for them, because they saw on social media or with their own eyes in Ottawa what was happening. And then you juxtapose that with the very, very inflammatory things the Prime Minister was saying, which was being backed up by a very loyal servitude press. And it was really quite something. I want to ask you, though, you sort of have a foot in both ponds, with independent media now and legacy media, and you're a freelance journalist, and you've written for all of these incredibly prestigious publications. So what are your thoughts on the current legacy media, and what do you think about the sort of new upstart environment where there's a whole bunch of new sort of either independent people doing Substacks like Barry Weiss, or independent media organizations that stay removed from government like True North?
I think it's a very exciting time to be an independent voice, because I think the public is starting to see they're starting to see what's happening, and I have these conversations with a range of different people who were, they would only believe what was said on the CBC or on a mainstream outlet, and that's starting to change. They're starting to see what is going on here, because some of what is being said is at complete odds with what they themselves are experiencing, just like with the protesters of the Freedom Convoy. And even if you were not here protesting, a lot of people saw through the propaganda and started questioning it. And I'm seeing, so I think this is a very exciting time for independent voices to make their mark. And as far as the legacy media is concerned, as far as the established media is concerned, I think they're going to have to start taking note. My piece for Barry Weiss probably resonated more than anything that was written in Canadian media. I think it was there's a space for that kind of reportage. There's clearly a market for that kind of reportage. There's a market for alternate opinions, I think. And like I mentioned, the public is just very starting to see through this and are craving for something that is different. And I think the mainstream media justifiably feels very threatened by what is happening in the independent media space, and just as well, because I think competition is good. I think plurality of different voices is better than just one hegemonic narrative that is in place thanks to state-funded media organizations. I think it's very important what independent media is doing, and I'm so grateful for the True North Center and media outlets like the True North Center for what they're doing, because if not for them, you'd just be fed on this constant it's constant propaganda, and it's not entirely 100% propaganda. Of course, there's some genuine bona fide reporting from the mainstream media establishment. It's just that I've noticed that when it comes to polarizing issues, whether it is reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic or it's the protests, there seems to be an agenda at play, and it's a clear agenda at work that wants to project a certain kind of narrative narrative, and that is where it gets very problematic for me. The media is a large space. Let me make that very clear. I write for the National Post. They're incredibly supportive of my opinions. They're I have a great platform with them, and so it's not so when I say the media, we have to be very careful, because there are players in the mainstream media establishment, like the National Post, for example, that do good work. And I'm not just saying that because I write for them, but I genuinely feel that they're the only ones who give me a voice, give me a platform, and that's important to recognize as well. But like I said, competition is good. We really need to have a contestation of ideas, and this is where the independent media outlets play a very important role.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the National Post hosts some of the most fantastic thinkers in Canada, people like yourself, Rex Murphy, Barbara Kay, Conrad Black. But then they're also part of the Post media chain, which often picks up Canadian press news stories where you get the sort of same regurgitated insider sort of perspective, which is it's unfortunate. There's obviously bigger issues at play with the legacy media. Rupa, one of the things I've noticed recently is that some of the better sort of reporting and opinion pieces on Canada, and specifically on Justin Trudeau, come from abroad. We had during the trucker convoy, the New York Times reporting on things that several times legacy media journalists, people like Rosemary Barton at the CBC, were openly criticizing and telling the New York Times to take this down because it's wrong. Well, it wasn't wrong. It just didn't fit with the Trudeau narrative. The idea that they were breaking into vehicles and arresting people at gunpoint. That was sort of like an inconvenient story that the Canadian media didn't want. One of the other things I've noticed is a sort of disconnect between. So in Canada, if you say that Justin Trudeau is acting like a dictator, or that Canada is going down a tyrannical or authoritarian path, the media sort of like clutch their pearls and say, like, that's reckless and hyperbolic. How dare you? More and more, we're hearing that opinion being taken from people around the world, outside observers, people who are critical of Trudeau. And I saw that you shared a piece by Rav Arora, who's a great young writer from Vancouver. He wrote a piece in the New York Post titled "Once a Liberal Democracy, Canada is Now an Authoritarian State." So it's a great piece. I encourage viewers to go out and read it. Rav argues that Canadian government has taken its power to extreme levels. He tells a story about how he almost wasn't allowed back into Canada, despite being a Canadian. And he also makes a point saying that, his family left India when he was a child, and he feels that, Canada is not necessarily more free than India. I'm wondering if you can give us your thoughts on Rav's piece and sort of generally that direction, that not only is Canada heading towards this direction, but you don't see these kind of opinion pieces much in Canada. Increasingly, you are seeing them around the world, though.
Exactly. I very much enjoyed Rav's piece, and I shared it. I shared a very important quote from the tweet where he says that, the country that my parents left behind, India, seems a lot less authoritarian than Canada at this point, because he's unvaccinated and he can't get on a plane, and he's essentially a prisoner in his own country. I think that's I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. I know a lot of unvaccinated people, and they're really struggling. It's and Canada is an outlier in this regard. India, a country that I'm also very familiar with, having spent a lot of time there, has no vaccine mandates in place. In fact, the Supreme Court of India said that vaccine mandates were unconstitutional, and in a recent ruling, and that you can't and emphasized on the importance of bodily autonomy. It was an extraordinary ruling, and it made me question why, what is happening with our courts here? Why aren't we seeing this kind of, why aren't we seeing this sort of thing happening here? And so a lot of people like Rav, feel that the country that they grew up in, and I will say this as someone who spent 25 years. I came here as a teenager, and I've been here for a long time, and I can tell you that I don't recognize this country anymore. I don't recognize what it, understand what is happening here. I don't know why Canada is an outlier here. Of course, there are problems with India. I wouldn't say that India is necessarily freer than Canada. I think that would be a little bit of an exaggeration if one were to say that, but one can certainly point to the fact that Canada is heading in the wrong direction. It is an outlier in the advanced West. It's an outlier among major countries in insisting on vaccine mandates, on the two-dose vaccine mandate, which makes absolutely no sense. You have research upon research coming up from various credible health agencies from across the world, whether it's the CDC, whether it's the UK Health Authority or UK Health Agency, that show that the two-dose vaccine regimen is actually not very effective at this point. Where if you've done 2 doses, you're really, the vaccine effectiveness has essentially gone down to 0. So, but the thing is, I can get on a plane and I can apply for a federal government job, but the unvaccinated can't, and that's what's very cruel about the situation. And also we've completely ignored the fact that a lot of unvaccinated people probably have a great deal of natural immunity at this point. At this point, everyone's more or less been infected. And so you have immunity from vaccination, and you also have immunity from having recovered from COVID-19. Yet the government insists on these vaccine mandates, which absolutely make no sense. So I appreciate where he's coming from, where Rav Arora is coming from, and I sympathize with it. And it is an absolutely frustrating situation to be in. And he faced a lot of pushback on the piece. In fact, I think a lot of people thought that I was writing the piece.
Your tweet sort of went viral. And because you're from India too, so, it kind of seemed like maybe you had written it, but yeah.
And the reactions were, borderline xenophobic, outright racist in a sense. They thought that I'd written the piece, or they thought that he had written, or they correctly assumed he wrote the piece, and they told us to go back to India if we felt that things were so bad here. Why are you here? Go back to India. Rav's response was, well, I'd like to, but I can't get on a plane. And I think that was his response. And honestly, that kind of response is extremely xenophobic and problematic, and it comes from the so-called liberal left, and because they're supposed to be better than this, but it doesn't take much to for these kinds of sentiments to come out. As anytime I criticize Canada, I'm told that I should just go back. Well, why should I? I chose this country. I chose to be here, and I choose to remain here, and I will fight for what is right. And that's really the best response you can give to such people. But it was quite extraordinary, the pushback, because I think Rav touched a nerve. And in a way that my piece did something similar. It touched a nerve, and I think I will quote this, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the New York Times correspondent who covered the protests for the New York Times was, I think, interviewed by Canada Land shortly after, and her parting shot was that I don't think Canadians are used to seeing themselves in this manner. And I think that's what's going on here. That explains the pushback that at least the pushback that she was getting, and I think that really does sum up the pushback. Describes the pushback that Rav and I have been getting.
Right. Well, I mean, what happened to the whole a Canadian is a Canadian is Canadian? In Rav's case, he moved to Canada when he was 4 years old. So it's not like it's not like he grew up in India and has a place to go back there. It's like his family made this choice. And interestingly for him, he's a young guy. I think he's in his early 20s. And the reason that he didn't get vaccinated is because he got COVID and he had natural immunity. So you're right. He probably has stronger immunity and a better chance of being okay than most other people.
Yeah. And that is the science. That is the science. Right. There is exactly. Actual science there, and we are completely ignoring it. And that is just very perplexing. Like if I can go to Germany tomorrow and I can show proof of, I either show proof of vaccination or proof of a negative COVID test or proof of recovery. A lot of European countries accept proof of recovery. What makes us so special? Why are we so different here? It's not just Canada, but it's also the US. And, then it leads to all of these questions, then it leads us into this rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. What is going on here? Is it the pharmaceutical companies? We bought all of these vaccines. Maybe they just want to push this on us because they bought all of these vaccines. I'd rather not go there. I'd rather take on the policy for what it is and criticize it. But it is quite extraordinary that we are an outlier in much of the world, and we're just it's needlessly punishing 5 or 6 million Canadians for making a medical decision.
Well, absolutely, and the bizarre decision this week for the federal government, the Liberal Party, and the NDP to extend these travel restrictions sort of indefinitely. It's like, we can't even at this point admit that most of these measures are no longer necessary. Some of them were never necessary in the first place. It's like they're completely sort of stuck to that. I wanted to ask you this, Rupa. You recently wrote on some of the various polls about Canadians, particularly new Canadians and new immigrants, how they're losing confidence in Canada and the direction. And I think this is what you're talking about, touched a nerve with a lot of Liberals, is that, the Leger poll commissioned by the Institute for Canadian Citizenship found that 30% of new Canadians aged 18 to 34 said they were more likely to move to another country within the next 2 years. Canada is a country that sort of prides itself on being very welcoming to immigrants. All the political parties are very pro-immigration, and Canada is sort of held up as this country where pluralism works and immigration has been successful. And yet, under this direction, of all people, Justin Trudeau, the person who sort of champions diversity as our strength, he says it all the time. And yet, under his leadership, especially young immigrants, which are the ones that really Canada wants to recruit because they're the ones that help our economy and help us grow and help balance out the aging population and the demographic crunch and all that kind of stuff. Increasingly, they don't want to come to Canada. They want to live here. I think this creates a huge problem for Trudeau. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your research and your reporting on this area?
Well, so I think if I remember correctly, that poll talked about how a lot of people were losing trust in the government. There was an increasing loss of trust in the way government works, and that there was a lack of democratic accountability. That people were generally feeling, and that is very interesting because. Normally new immigrants are not necessarily looking at these issues. I would say they're focused on the bread and butter issues. They're looking at they're looking at employment options. They want to send their kids to school. They want to earn a living. So the fact that they're focused on these other issues is quite extraordinary. And I think there's a general sense of malaise that everybody's been feeling, especially over the last couple of years. And new immigrants are not immune from that. In fact, I would say that new immigrants have also probably been at the receiving end of some of these harsh restrictions, whether it's the mandates. I've met a few new immigrants who don't want to be vaccinated, and so it affects them directly. And just this, like as I said, there's a general sense of malaise. Where are we going here? And there's a lot of other stuff going on here as well. New immigrants tend to be generally very conservative. I think new immigrants probably, and I can't speak for all new immigrants, but generally conservative new immigrants are not necessarily interested in wokeism. This is not something that they identify with. If you tell a conservative new immigrant that a woman is not really a woman, or that there is no such thing as a woman, they're going to be shocked at these kinds of views. And so there's a cultural element to this. I conjecture. I don't have data to back this up, but I do think that there's a strong cultural component to the way new immigrants feel about being in Canada, because Canada, in a sense, has completely, bought into this woke narrative more than any other country, maybe except for the United States. But certainly, European countries there's a great deal of, there's a contestation of these narratives, much more than what we're seeing here. And so there's a strong cultural component, economic component. Sure, new immigrants are always struggling to find jobs. The fact that they come here highly skilled and can't translate those skills into meaningful employment here, that continues to be an issue. I know the Ford government is working on changing that, but there's still a lot of PhDs and doctors driving taxis. So there is still an economic component. It still matters, but I think increasingly there is also a cultural component to this general feeling of malaise, and that they're not happy being here.
Absolutely. Well, another news story this week is that the Trudeau government is decriminalizing drugs in British Columbia. I know that's one issue that for my husband's family is from Iran, and that's something that they just really can't wrap their head around. Just from like a human dignity perspective, why is Canada allowing people to use heroin and these other hard drugs? There's such a huge disconnect, and it is really interesting to see Trudeau. I think he's really jumping the shark with so many of these issues, where he's just so incredibly out of touch with the people he purports to stand for. Well, Rupa, I can't tell you how excited we are to have you as part of the team. It's such an honor, and I'm really looking forward to your contributions with us. Tell us a little bit about your podcast, what viewers can expect, and what kind of issues you're going to be diving into.
Well, no, it's an honor, Candice, and I'm so thrilled that I'm doing this for the True North Center, and I'm really excited about what is going to come in the coming weeks and months. So first of all, I'm going to be it's going to be about 20 minutes or so, and we'll have I'll have a guest on, and I'll obviously pick the topics. And these are topics and ideas that I care about, and so it'll be similar to the kinds of things that I write about. But the difference being that we'll have more in-depth conversations, and also talk about things that I couldn't go into my column. So it'll be everything from all of the issues that we care about and the issues that don't necessarily make it into mainstream media conversations. I think that is very important for me. I do want to give some attention to these issues, and that's basically where I'm coming from, and hopefully it'll stimulate an interesting conversation around these topics as we go on. And my viewers, my listeners don't necessarily have to agree with me. I think it would be good if they actually disagreed with me. I think it would spark a discussion around these things, around these ideas. But so I want them to be able to get something out of these discussions. I want it to be intellectual. I want it to be stimulating. Some of the topics may be provocative, but I'm not shy about being provocative. So I think it hopes to be very promising, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, that's great, Rupa. I can't wait. Your first episode's going to air next week, so everyone stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for joining the show, and thank you for joining us, and welcome aboard to True North.
Thank you so much, Candice. It's a pleasure.
Okay, that's Rupa Subramanya, now with True North. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.